The alarm goes off at 4:30 in the morning. Coffee in the dark, headlights on an empty road, a boat sliding into black water you can barely see. Every serious angler has done it, because we've all absorbed the same gospel. The dawn patrol is the holiest window in fishing, and if you're not on the water at sunrise, you've already lost. I'm going to take a side today, and it isn't the popular one. Across most of the season, and most of the species you actually chase, the evening quietly beats the morning. Not by folklore, by biology. The hour before and after sunset outproduces the hour after dawn in more situations than the fishing culture is willing to admit, and the anglers who figured that out tend to keep very quiet about it. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why the dusk window wins. You'll be able to name the 4 biological reasons out loud, and you'll know the handful of specific times when the morning genuinely is the better call. This isn't a coin flip. There's a right answer, and it's hiding in the science. Welcome back to Fishing Lab Explained. Let's build the case. Start with the thing both camps agree on, because we have to clear it out of the way first. Low light matters. The reason dawn and dusk both outfish high noon is the same across nearly every freshwater and saltwater species, and it lives inside the eye of a predator. A largemouth bass, a walleye, a pike. None of them have eyelids. None of them can squeeze their pupils down the way you do walking out of a dark theater into the sun. A fish is optically stuck with whatever light the day hands it. So under a high midday sun, a predator isn't enjoying the brightness, it's enduring it. The glare floods its retina, kills contrast, and makes the fish physically uncomfortable. That's why bass slide into shade and deep cover at noon, and why a July trout in clear water tucks under a rock instead of feeding in the open. They don't stop eating. They just feed cautiously, in the shadows. Now drop the light, and the fish's eye does something you and I cannot do. It physically rebuilds itself. Inside the retina, the dim light cells shift forward, the daytime cells retract, and the shielding pigment pulls back. Biologists call this the retinomotor response, and here's the part that matters. It isn't a passive reaction to darkness, it's anticipatory. Crepuscular species like brown trout run this twilight changeover on an internal clock, even when they're held in constant darkness. Their eyes literally expect the transition. The fish is pre-wired, at the cellular level, to hunt the in-between. And some predators went further. Walleye carry a tapetum lucidum, a mirror behind the retina that bounces light back through the photoreceptors for a second pass, squeezing extra vision out of near darkness. It's what throws back that eerie orange eyeshine in a headlamp. The result is an asymmetry. In fading light, a walleye still sees, while the baitfish it hunts goes effectively blind. That gap is the predatory window. So far, so even. Because here's the inconvenient truth for the dawn patrol crowd. That transition, that eye advantage, happens at sunrise and at sunset. On light alone, morning and evening tie. If the eye were the only factor, you could flip a coin. It isn't. There are 3 more variables, and every single one of them breaks the tie for the evening. Let me hand them to you one at a time. Tiebreaker number 1, oxygen. And this is the dawn patrol's dirty little secret, the thing almost nobody fishing at sunrise accounts for. The breathable oxygen in your lake, dissolved oxygen, isn't set by temperature alone, it's set by a daily tug-of-war. All day, underwater plants and algae photosynthesize and pump oxygen into the water. All night photosynthesis shuts off, but every living thing in that lake keeps breathing. The plants, the algae, the bacteria, the fish, pulling oxygen back out. Nothing coming in, everything still taking out. So oxygen slides downhill all night and bottoms out at its lowest point of the entire 24-hour cycle, at one precise moment, dawn. Sit with that irony. The sacred sunrise window, especially in warm, weedy, shallow summer water, can drop you on the lake at the exact hour the water is most starved of oxygen. And a fish in low-oxygen water is sluggish and short-fused, less stamina, shorter strikes, far less willing to chase a bait down. Picture it concretely. A shallow, weed-choked summer pond on a hot, still night is the worst-case version of this. All that vegetation respiring in the dark until the water at dawn is gasping, and the fish with it. That's the morning so many anglers can't figure out, the one where the lake looks perfect and nothing eats. Deeper, cleaner, less vegetated water swings less, which is exactly why the dawn bite holds up better on big rocky reservoirs than on a fertile little farm pond. Read your water, and you can predict the trap before you ever launch. Now flip to dusk. By sunset, the water is holding the maximum oxygen a full day of photosynthesis could produce. As the air cools and the surface eases off its daily high, the water's ability to hold that oxygen actually improves. So the evening hands a fish something the dawn physically cannot: comfortable temperature and peak oxygen, stacked right on top of the predatory window. That's the difference between a fish that nips once and a fish that hunts hard for an hour. It's a huge part of why the violent surface feeding you hear so often comes in the last light of the day. Tiebreaker 1, evening. Tiebreaker number 2, and to me it's the decider. Where is the food? Because perfect eyes and a full tank of oxygen mean nothing if the prey isn't in reach. This is where I bring in something the average fishing video never mentions: the single largest synchronized movement of life on planet Earth, and it happens in your lake every evening. It's called Diel vertical migration. All day, as the sun climbs, countless zooplankton, the tiny drifting animals at the base of the food web, sink into the dark, deep water to hide from anything hunting by sight. Then, as the light fades at dusk, that entire mass of life rises, billions of organisms climbing into the warm, food-rich surface layer under the cover of dimming light. And that upward surge fires a chain reaction straight up the food chain. The little visual-feeding baitfish follow the zooplankton up, and the gamefish follow the baitfish, sliding off their deep daytime haunts and up onto the weed edges, points, and shoreline flats. Read what that means for you. At evening, the entire pantry rises toward you. The bait climbs into the shallows where you can reach it, with the predators right behind. The morning has no equivalent. At first light, yesterday's pattern has reset, the bait is scattered, and the day's movements haven't organized yet. This is also why the where matters as much as the when. At dusk, the highest percentage water is the transition zone, where deep structure meets shallow flat, the weed edge, the point, the drop where bait is funneling up and predators are stacking to ambush it. Park on that seam in the last hour of light and you are sitting directly on top of the migration. And there's a compounding layer on top. A bass that fed at dawn, rode out the harsh midday in the shade, and is now sliding into the evening, is a fish operating on a full day of intelligence. It has spent hours learning where the bait is stacking up, and it enters that final window with a plan and an accumulated appetite. The dawn fish is starting from a blank page. Tiebreaker 2, evening, decisively. Tiebreaker number 3, thermal direction. And this is where I'll be honest with you about the one card the morning truly holds. In the evening, the water is cooling down from its daily maximum, dropping back into the temperature range where predators feed comfortably. That's a genuine improvement, the thermal stress of the midday heat lifting away. In the morning, the water is warming off an overnight low, which is really just the stabilization of a cold baseline, not the same kind of improvement. So across spring, summer, and early fall, the thermal trend favors the evening too. But here is the morning's one legitimate trump card, and I won't pretend it away. Summer thermal relief. In the dead heat of July and August, midday surface temperatures climb past what most fish can stand, driving them deep and shutting the shallow bite down hard. Dawn delivers the single coolest water of the whole cycle, and for a few hours, that relief pulls bass and especially trout back up shallow to feed aggressively. In high summer for those species, the morning genuinely wins. That's real, and if you're chasing summer topwater bass, set the alarm. But notice what it is. One card, in one season, for certain species. Outside of it, the dusk hand is stronger. So let me say the verdict plainly before we talk tackle. Light is a tie. Oxygen goes to evening. Food position goes to evening. Thermal direction goes to evening, except for the summer morning exception. 3 of 4, often 4 of 4. The evening wins more than it loses. Now let's fish it. Here's the practical hinge. When light drops and a fish can't lean on its eyes, it doesn't go offline. It switches sensory channels, and that single fact should decide your lure. In low light, Predators run on the lateral line, a row of fluid-filled canals down each flank lined with tiny sensors that read pressure and low-frequency vibration. It's hearing through the skin, feeling a struggling baitfish across a dark flat without seeing a thing. And the physics is wildly in the fish's favor, because sound and vibration travel roughly 4 times faster and far farther in water than in air. Which means for the evening bite, 2 things, and only 2, actually matter in a lure: how much water it pushes and what silhouette it throws. Realism is irrelevant in low light. This is exactly why a beat-up lure from your grandfather's box quietly outfishes a $40 modern bait. Physics, not nostalgia. The Fred Arbogast Jitterbug, around since the late 1930s, waddles across the surface with a clumsy bloop bloop bloop. A modern photo-finish topwater is sculpted to look like a real shad down to the scale, and completely wasted at dusk, because the fish can't see those scales. What it feels is water being shoved. The Jitterbug's whole genius is its inefficiency. It displaces a ton of water and hammers the lateral line. Pair that with color science, the tackle wall gets backward. In low light, skip the glowing UV baits and throw a solid black or deep purple lure, because when a fish looks up at the faintly glowing surface, a dark bait stamps a hard, crisp silhouette it can lock onto, while a bright bait dissolves into the glow. The legendary black Jitterbug is deadly because it maxes both variables at once: maximum displacement, maximum silhouette. The same logic carries the original balsa wood Rapala, hand-carved by Lauri Rapala in Finland back in the 1930s. Balsa's odd, ultralight density gives it an erratic, hunting wobble plastic struggles to fake. Fish it on a stop-and-go in that evening window. When you pause, the buoyant balsa darts upward, snapping off a sudden change in its vibration signature that reads, to a predator trailing it in the dark, as a dying baitfish, and triggers the strike. And when the bite pushes a little deeper at last light, a lipless rattler like the Bill Lewis rattle trap, born in the 1960s, packs BBs that clack at high frequency and call a hungry walleye or bass from yards away, long before it ever sees the lure. One cadence note that ties it all together. In low light, slow down. A fish hunting by feel needs a beat to track and intercept a target it can't see clearly, so a slower retrieve with deliberate pauses outfishes a fast, frantic one nearly every evening. You're giving the lateral line time to do its work. Now the complete answer the title promised, because the size of the evening edge changes with the season and the species, and a real angler fishes the calendar, not a habit. In spring, both windows produce, but the evening takes it. The afternoon sun warms the shallows into the most active range of the day, and the evening emergence of aquatic insects makes the last hour of light the most reliable bite of the season. In summer, the answer splits, and this is the morning's moment. Dawn's thermal relief pulls bass and trout shallow, so first light earns its alarm. But don't write the summer evening off. Once the surface finally sheds its afternoon heat, often not until 7 o'clock or later, that dusk bite roars back with peak oxygen behind it. In fall, the evening doesn't just win, it dominates, and it isn't close. The cooling water is dropping into the optimal range where bass, walleye, trout, and panfish are all active at once. Fish are gorging to pack on winter fat, and the baitfish are schooled in tight, predictable wads. Fall evenings are the single best window on the entire calendar, and in winter the whole thing inverts. A January dawn is the coldest, deadest hour of the day, and the real bite swings to the middle of the afternoon, roughly noon to 3, after the sun has had hours to warm a shallow flat or a dark mud bottom a few critical degrees. Species sharpen the picture. Walleye are the most committed evening fish in freshwater. That tapetum-equipped eye gives them their sharpest edge precisely at the dusk transition, when their vision holds and their prey collapses. Catfish go even further, with a rod-heavy, low-light retina and a chemical sensing system so extreme that a channel cat carries well over 100,000 taste buds scattered across its entire body, a swimming tongue that smells and tastes prey in total blackness. The catfish isn't a low-light feeder. It's a night specialist for which the evening is just the doorway into its prime time. For these fish, morning versus evening isn't even a contest. And here's the window almost nobody fishes, the one that proves the whole thesis. because it shows the bite is about light, not the clock. A heavily overcast day. The harsh midday glare never arrives, so functionally the entire day becomes one long, soft, low-light window, a permanent twilight that runs for hours instead of 40 minutes. Fish that would be pinned to deep cover at noon will roam and hunt straight through the middle of the day. An angler who reads a cloud forecast can get dusk-quality fishing at 1 in the afternoon on an empty lake while everyone else is home, convinced they missed the bite. And it explains the moment every angler has lived. The fish are crushing it, the clouds break, the sun pours through, and the bite dies on the spot, like a switch flipped. That wasn't your luck running out. It was the retinomotor response firing in every fish's eye at once, telling them their advantage just evaporated. There's one more edge to the evening, and it has nothing to do with biology. It's other anglers. On popular public water, the dawn armada launches at sunrise and pounds the best spots all morning. By afternoon, those fish have seen lures, heard motors, and gotten cautious. Show up at 5 o'clock and you're fishing water that has rested since noon. Quiet ramps, untouched points, and fish that have had hours to shake off the morning pressure and resume feeding. Biological advantage and an empty lake stacked together. That's the part the evening crowd really keeps quiet. So how do you actually plan the perfect evening session? Read 3 things before you ever leave the driveway. First, the cloud cover. A soft, overcast sky stretches the low-light window for hours and can let you start early. Second, the wind. A light evening breeze breaking up the surface gives predators cover and pushes plankton and bait against a windward bank, so fish into the wind toward that shoreline rather than hiding from it. Third, the water temperature trend. On a brutal summer day, don't even bother until the surface has shed its heat, often well past 7. On a mild fall evening, get there earlier, because the bite starts the moment the water enters that optimal range. Match those 3 reads. Set up on a weed edge or point where deep water meets shallow, and you've engineered the highest percentage window in fishing on purpose. Let me leave you with one idea that hints the evening edge may even be growing. Modern telemetry has shown that individual fish have their own internal clocks, chronotypes, larks and owls, literally. A 2025 meta-analysis in the journal Fish and Fisheries pooled 44 tracking datasets across 34 wild species and found stable, individual differences in when fish wake and rest, the extreme early risers starting more than 5 hours before sunrise, the late sleepers not switching on until more than 5 hours after, with species like carp and eel among them. Now here's the inference, and I'll flag it honestly as an argument, not settled fact. If a whole lake's worth of anglers hammers the dawn year after year, we're preferentially catching the early rising larkfish while the owls sleep through the assault untouched. We know from solid work on fishing-induced evolution that angling can shift a population's behavior over generations, so it's reasonable to suspect that on heavily pressured water, the morning bite is fading, partly because of us, and the evening, increasingly, is where the uneducated fish are. So, morning or evening, which actually wins? The evening. More seasons, more species, more often than the fishing world admits, because the dusk window stacks high oxygen, rising food, cooling water, and a fully fed-up predator on top of the same low-light eye advantage the morning offers. Set the dawn alarm for summer bass and trout, fish the midday in winter, chase any cloudy afternoon you can, but stop defaulting to sunrise out of pure habit. The fish that have figured out the evening are out there feeding in peace, on an empty lake, while everyone else is asleep by 9, planning to do the hard thing at 4:30 again. Thanks for spending this one in the lab. If it changed how you see something you've done 1,000 times, hit like and subscribe, and settle it for me in the comments. Are you dawn patrol, or do you stay out past dark? I'll read them. Until next time, keep observing, keep questioning the obvious, and I'll see you out on the water.